Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you're here, it's probably because the day is winding down. Maybe you're already settled in. Maybe the lights are low and the room is quiet. Whatever brought you here tonight, we're glad you came. This is a place for slow stories, real ones, lives that were actually lived. We tell them gently, without rushing, and without any need for you to hold on tight. You can simply let the words wash over you, and if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, that's exactly as it should be. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with the life of Claudette Colvin. She was a young girl who grew up in Alabama in the middle of the 20th century, a time when the American South was still shaped by laws that kept black and white people separated in almost every part of daily life. She was 15 years old when she did something that very few people at the time had the courage to do. She refused to give up her seat on a city bus. That moment happened 9 months before Rosa Parks did the same thing, and yet for decades, most people had never heard her name. There's something quietly meaningful about that, about a person who acted with real courage and then watched the world move on without fully remembering her. And yet she kept living. She built a life. She raised a family. And late in her years, the world finally began to find its way back to her story. I find myself drawn to lives like hers, not the loudest ones, not the ones that took up all the space, but the ones that did something real and then simply continued. There's a kind of steadiness in that, a quiet dignity that I think is worth sitting with for a while. So let's begin at the beginning. Claudette Colvin was born on September 5th, 1939, in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham in 1939 was a city shaped by steel and industry. It was one of the largest cities in the American South, and like much of the South at that time, it was also a city shaped by segregation. The laws that separated Black Americans from white Americans in public spaces were not suggestions or customs. They were enforced rules. They were part of everyday life, in a way that is difficult to fully imagine today. Growing up black in Birmingham meant navigating a world that told you, in 100 small and large ways, that you were less than, that you belonged in certain places and not others, that your comfort, your safety, and your dignity were not the priority of the world around you. Claudette was born into that world. Her early childhood was spent in Birmingham, but while she was still very young, she moved to Montgomery, Alabama. She went to live with her great-aunt and great-uncle, Mary Ann and Q.P. Colvin. They raised her as their own daughter. She took their last name, and Montgomery became the city she thought of as home. Montgomery in those years was the capital of Alabama. It was a city with a particular weight to its history. It had been the first capital of the Confederacy, and decades after the Civil War, it was still a place where the structures of racial separation ran very deep. Claudette grew up in a neighborhood called King Hill. It was a working-class area, the kind of neighborhood where people looked out for one another, where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where children played outside and families gathered on porches in the evenings when the heat of the day finally began to ease. The Colvin household was a stable one. Q.P. Colvin worked quietly and steadily. Mary Ann kept the home together. They were not wealthy people, but they were caring people. And Claudette, as she grew up, was surrounded by a sense of community that was real and rooted. Church was an important part of that community, as it was for so many black families in the South during that era. The church was more than a place of worship. It was a gathering place, a place where people could speak freely, support one another, and find some sense of dignity and belonging in a world that too often denied them both. Claudette grew up attending church regularly. The rhythms of that community, the music, the language, the sense of shared faith, all of it became part of who she was. She was a thoughtful child. She read a great deal. She asked questions. She was curious about the world around her in a way that would become important later on. As she moved through her childhood and into her early teenage years, she began to attend Booker T. Washington High School in Montgomery. It was one of the schools available to black students in the city, a segregated school, as all the schools were at that time. But it was also a place with teachers who cared deeply about their students, teachers who pushed them to think carefully, to take their education seriously, to believe that their minds mattered, even in a world that was slow to agree. One of the things that stood out about Claudette as a student was her interest in ideas. She was the kind of person who thought about things, who turned them over quietly and came back to them. She wasn't simply absorbing what she was told. She was engaging with it. And in the early 1950s, there was a great deal to think about. The country was beginning to wrestle more openly with the question of racial equality. The civil rights movement, as it would come to be known, had not yet fully taken shape, but the conditions for it were forming. Legal challenges were beginning to move through the courts. People were gathering. Conversations were happening in churches and living rooms and on street corners. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. The ruling declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was a significant moment. For many Black Americans, it felt like something important had shifted. The law had said, officially and clearly, that separate was not equal. For a teenager like Claudette, already curious and already thinking carefully about the world around her, that ruling landed with real weight. It said something. It confirmed something she and people like her had always known. And it opened a door to the possibility that other things might change too. She was 15 years old in the spring of 1955. She was in the 10th grade, and on the second day of March that year, she boarded a city bus in Montgomery to ride home from school. The bus system in Montgomery, like nearly everything else in the city, was segregated. Black passengers were required to sit at the back of the bus. If the front section, reserved for white passengers, filled up, black passengers in the middle rows were expected to give up their seats and move further back. This was not just custom. It was the law. On that afternoon, Claudette was seated in a row of the bus that straddled the unofficial line between the two sections. She was sitting next to a classmate. The front of the bus had filled. A white woman was standing. The bus driver told the black passengers in that row to give up their seats and move back. Claudette's classmate moved. The woman seated beside her moved. Claudette did not. She stayed where she was. The driver repeated the instruction. She held her position. There were tense words. Other passengers watched. And then, after some time had passed, 2 police officers boarded the bus. They spoke to Claudette. She told them clearly that she had paid her fare, that she had a right to her seat, that what was being asked of her was unjust. The officers arrested her. They handcuffed her and removed her from the bus. She was taken to the city jail. She was 15 years old. She was still in her school clothes, and she had just done something that almost no one in Montgomery had done before. She had refused. She had refused quietly, clearly, and completely. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't made a scene beyond what the situation itself created. She simply would not move. Later, she would say that she felt as though the weight of history was pressing down on her, that she felt the presence of the people who had come before her, people who had never been given the choice she was making in that moment. She felt she owed it to them not to move, that she couldn't. It was a remarkable thing to carry at 15. After her arrest, she was charged with several violations. She was taken through the legal system. Her case drew the attention of people in the Montgomery Black community who were already beginning to think about how to challenge the bus segregation laws directly. Among those people was a woman named Rosa Parks, and there was also a young minister who had recently arrived in Montgomery, a man who would soon become one of the most important leaders of the movement. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. These were people who understood that the law could be challenged, that a case, the right case, could be taken through the courts in a way that might force real change. They were watching. They were thinking about strategy. They needed someone whose situation could serve as that case. For a brief time, Claudette Colvin's case was considered, but the community leaders ultimately decided not to use it as the basis for a major public test case. There were concerns about her age and about whether she was the right person in that moment to carry that weight publicly. Later, in 1955, her pregnancy would add to those concerns in the eyes of some movement leaders. Claudette was set aside. It was a painful thing. She had done something brave and real, and she was being told, gently but clearly, that it wasn't going to be her moment after all. She continued her life. She continued school. The world moved on around her. And then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. It became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. It lasted for over a year, and it ended with a legal ruling that Montgomery's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. Claudette Colvin's name was not in the headlines, but she had not disappeared entirely from the story. Her name appeared in a different way. When the legal challenge to Montgomery's bus segregation laws was formally filed in court, Claudette Colvin was one of 4 women named as plaintiffs in the case. The case was called Browder versus Gayle, and it was that case, moving through the federal courts, that ultimately produced the ruling which ended bus segregation in Montgomery. Rosa Parks is the name most people remember, and her courage was real and significant. But the legal victory that changed the law came, in part, because Claudette Colvin stood up and told her story in court, because she was willing to put her name on a lawsuit, because she was willing to say, clearly and on the record, that what had been done to her was wrong. She was 16 years old when she testified. She sat in a courtroom and described what had happened to her on that bus. She described being told to move. She described refusing. She described being arrested. And she described it all calmly and with a clarity that the court could not easily dismiss. That testimony mattered. It was part of what made the case. And yet, when the ruling came down, and when the boycott ended in triumph, the celebrations did not center on Claudette Colvin. The story that was told to the wider world was the story of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and the thousands of Montgomery residents who had walked to work for over a year rather than ride the segregated buses. All of that was true and worth celebrating. But Claudette's part in it tended to get left out. There were reasons for that. Some of them had to do with the decisions made by community leaders about who to put forward publicly. Some of them had to do with circumstances in her personal life that made certain people uncomfortable at the time. And some of it was simply the way history tends to work. It finds a few names to hold on to, and the rest get carried along quietly beneath the surface. Claudette was carried along quietly. She was a teenager living in Montgomery in the aftermath of something large. The city had changed, at least in one specific and legal way. The buses were now desegregated. Black passengers could sit where they chose. That was a real thing. It had happened. But Montgomery itself had not transformed overnight. The structures of segregation ran through every part of life, not just the buses. And the people who had pushed back against those structures, especially the younger ones, the ones without the protection of status or age, sometimes found that the world around them became harder rather than easier. For Claudette, life in Montgomery after 1955 and 1956 was not simple. She had been a plaintiff in a federal lawsuit. She had been arrested. She had stood up publicly in a way that not everyone in her community had been ready for. And in a city where racial tensions were still very much alive, that kind of visibility could carry a cost. She finished her schooling as best she could under the circumstances. She had been a good student, a thoughtful one. But the world she was moving through was complicated, and the personal circumstances of her life were adding their own weight to things. She had a son during her teenage years. She was young. She was navigating a great deal at once. And the support that might have surrounded her, the recognition that might have helped carry her forward, was largely absent. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because this is one of the quieter, sadder parts of her story. Not dramatic, not filled with conflict, just the ordinary difficulty of being a young person who did something meaningful and then had to keep living in a world that wasn't quite sure what to do with her. She had given something real to the movement. She had taken a risk that very few people were willing to take. And then she had been, in a certain sense, passed over. Not with cruelty, not with malice, just with the quiet, practical logic of people who were thinking about strategy and optics and what the moment required. She understood some of it. She said so, later in her life. She understood why the leaders made the choices they made. She didn't carry a bitter anger about it, at least not one that consumed her. But she also didn't pretend it hadn't happened. It had, and it shaped the years that followed. After some time, Claudette made a decision that a great many young Black Americans made during those years. She left the South. She moved to New York City. This was sometime in the late 1950s. The exact timing of her move settled into the later part of that decade, as Montgomery, and its complicated memories receded behind her. New York was a different world. It was louder, faster, more anonymous. In a city that size, no one needed to know your history. You could simply be a person trying to build a life. And that was what Claudette set out to do. She found work. She worked for many years in New York, primarily as a nurse's aide. It was steady, careful work, the kind of work that requires patience and attention and a genuine willingness to be present with people who are vulnerable. It suited something in her character. She was not a person who needed the spotlight. She was a person who showed up and did what needed to be done. Her son was growing up. She was managing a household. She was doing the quiet daily work of building a life from the ground up in a city that didn't stop moving long enough to notice her. Decades passed. The civil rights movement continued through the 1960s. It produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It produced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It produced marches and speeches and legislation and loss. It produced moments of extraordinary courage and moments of devastating violence. And through all of it, the name Claudette Colvin remained largely unknown to the wider public. Rosa Parks became an icon, rightfully so. Her dignity and courage were real. But the fuller story, the story that included a 15-year-old girl who had done something similar 9 months earlier, who had testified in the court case that changed the law, that story was still mostly waiting to be told. There were scholars who knew. There were historians and researchers who had done the careful work of looking through court records and old newspaper clippings and oral histories. They knew that Claudette Colvin existed. They knew what she had done. And quietly, carefully, her name began to appear in books and academic papers. But it took a long time for that knowledge to reach the wider world. In 2009, a writer named Philip Hoos published a book specifically about Claudette Colvin. It was written for young readers. It was called Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. The title came from the 2 ways she had contributed to the movement: her act of refusal on the bus and her testimony in the Browder versus Gayle case. The book won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature that year. It was a significant moment. For many readers, it was the first time they had ever encountered her name. For Claudette herself, now in her late 60s, it was a kind of arrival, a recognition that had been a long time coming. She was still living quietly, still in New York, still the same person she had always been. But now, the world was beginning to find its way to her, and she received that attention with a kind of calm grace that seemed entirely consistent with who she was. She didn't perform surprise or false modesty. She also didn't claim a bitterness she didn't fully feel. She simply told her story, clearly, honestly, in her own words. She'd always been able to do that. It was, in many ways, the same quality that had kept her in her seat on that bus in 1955. A quiet certainty, a sense of knowing what was true and being willing to say so, even when the world around her made that difficult. The years after the book brought more attention, more interviews, more recognition from schools and civil rights organizations. She was invited to speak. She was included in documentaries and educational materials. The long silence around her name began, slowly and steadily, to be filled in. there was something particularly moving about watching that happen, because she was not a young woman by then. She was someone who had lived most of her life without the acknowledgement that she deserved. She had raised her son. She had worked for decades. She had carried the memory of what she had done largely on her own. And now, in the later chapters of her life, the story was finally catching up to her. She handled it with the same steadiness she had always carried. She was not bitter. She was not performing gratitude. She was simply present, patient, honest. She talked about what it had felt like to be 15 years old on that bus. She talked about the fear and the certainty that had existed side by side in her chest. She talked about what it had meant to her and what she had hoped it might mean for others. She talked about the years in New York and the long, quiet stretch of her adult life. And she talked about what it felt like to finally be heard. One of the things she said in various interviews over the years was that she had never stopped believing that what she had done was right. That even when the world moved on without her, even when her name disappeared from the story, she had held on to that knowledge. She had known what she did and why she did it. And that had been enough to carry her through. That kind of quiet self-possession is rare. It's the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines. It doesn't fit easily into a short story or a soundbite. But it's one of the most important things about her. She'd done something brave. She'd been passed over. She'd kept going. And she had never lost her sense of herself in the process. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The night is quiet now. The story is unfolding slowly, the way it should. There is still more to tell. We'll continue moving through her life, through the later years of recognition, through the ways her story has reached new generations, through the final chapters of a life that was, in so many ways, quietly extraordinary. But for now, just let this part of the story settle. A girl in Montgomery, a seat on a bus, a refusal that changed something real, even if the world took a long time to say so, and a woman who waited, patiently and with dignity, for the world to finally catch up. Let's go back for a moment, back to Montgomery, back to 1955, because there are some things worth understanding about the world Claudette grew up in. Things that help explain not just what she did, but why it mattered so much, and why it was so difficult. The bus system in Montgomery was something that nearly every black resident of the city used every single day. Most black families in Montgomery did not own cars. The bus was how people got to work, to school, to church, to the market. It was essential. There was no real alternative for most people. And yet riding the bus was also a daily experience of humiliation. The rules were clear and enforced. Black passengers entered through the front door to pay their fare, then had to exit and re-enter through the back door to find a seat. They were confined to the rear section of the bus. If the white section at the front filled up, black passengers in the middle rows were expected to give up their seats entirely. Not just to shift over, to stand, to move back, to make themselves smaller so that a white passenger could sit. Drivers had the authority to enforce these rules, and some of them enforced them with particular harshness. This happened every day, multiple times a day, for many people. It was woven into the ordinary rhythm of life in a way that was designed to be wearing, designed to communicate, constantly and without words, a message about who mattered and who did not. Claudette had grown up riding those buses. She had experienced those rules firsthand. By the time she was in high school, she had spent years navigating a system that treated her as less than, and she had been thinking about it. That's one of the things that gets lost sometimes in the way her story is told. The image of a spontaneous act, a girl who simply snapped one afternoon and refused to move. But that isn't quite right. Claudette had been reading. She had been thinking carefully about justice and about history. Her teachers at Booker T. Washington High School had been encouraging their students to engage with the ideas of the time. The Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education had come down the previous year, in 1954. That ruling was being discussed. Its implications were being turned over in classrooms and homes and churches all across the Black South. Claudette had also been reading about the United States Constitution, about the rights it was supposed to guarantee. She had been thinking about the distance between what the Constitution said and what her daily life looked like. That distance was not abstract to her. She felt it every time she boarded a bus. So when that afternoon came, on the 2nd of March in 1955, and the bus driver told her to give up her seat, the refusal that came out of her was not purely impulsive. It was connected to something she had been building inside herself for a long time. She knew what was right. She knew what the law was supposed to mean. And in that moment, those two things were enough. The arrest was frightening. She was young, and being handcuffed and taken to a city jail is a frightening thing at any age. But she didn't waver, even in the police car, even at the jail. She maintained a clarity about why she had done what she had done. Her family came for her. She was released. And then the quieter, more complicated part began. The Black community in Montgomery was not a single, unified thing. It was made up of many different people, with many different ideas about how change should happen, and how fast and through what means. There were those who believed in direct action. There were those who believed in legal challenges. There were those who were simply trying to survive, and who feared that confrontation would bring down more violence and more hardship on the community. All of those positions were understandable. All of them came from real experience. The leaders who were beginning to think strategically about the bus situation, people like E.D. Nixon, a respected figure in the local NAACP, and a young Joanne Robinson, who taught at Alabama State College and was deeply involved in the Women's Political Council. These were people who understood that the moment of confrontation, when it came publicly, needed to be as strong as possible. They needed a plaintiff whose story was clean, whose personal circumstances would not give opponents an easy way to dismiss the case or distract from the central injustice. Claudette's case was complicated by personal circumstances. She was a teenager, and later in 1955, when she became pregnant while unmarried, that too became part of why some movement leaders worried her story would be used against the cause in the deeply conservative social climate of the time. It was a painful calculation, and Claudette was the one who paid the price for it. She understood, in broad terms, what was happening. She was not kept completely in the dark. But understanding a thing doesn't always make it easier to carry. She had done something real and brave, and she was being asked, quietly and without much ceremony, to step back. She stepped back. She continued her life. She continued school. She watched from a distance as the community kept organizing. And then Rosa Parks was arrested in December of that same year. Rosa Parks was, in many ways, the person the community had been waiting for. She was older. She was respected. She was a trained activist who had attended the Highlander Folk School, a place that brought together civil rights workers from across the South. She was dignified in a way that was difficult to attack, and her personal circumstances were, in the strategic sense, uncomplicated. When she refused to give up her seat on December 1st, 1955, the community was ready to move. The Montgomery bus boycott began within days. It was an extraordinary thing. For 381 days, Black residents of Montgomery refused to ride the city buses. They walked to work. They organized carpools. They arranged for rides through the Black-owned taxi companies. They endured harassment and intimidation. Some lost their jobs. Some faced violence. But they held. And the economic pressure of losing the majority of their ridership was real and significant for the bus company. Meanwhile, the legal challenge was moving through the courts. Claudette's situation had not been forgotten by everyone. The lawyers building the federal case, Fred Gray was the primary attorney, understood that they needed plaintiffs, real people who had experienced real violations of their constitutional rights on the Montgomery buses. People who were willing to put their names on a lawsuit and stand behind it. Claudette was asked to be one of those plaintiffs. She said yes. She was one of 4 women whose experiences formed the basis of the Browder versus Gayle case. The case was filed in federal district court. It argued that the bus segregation laws in Montgomery were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. And in June of 1956, a panel of federal judges agreed. They ruled that the bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. The city of Montgomery appealed. The case went to the United States Supreme Court. And in November of 1956, the Supreme Court affirmed the lower court's ruling. The buses in Montgomery were desegregated. It was a genuine victory, a legal, binding, enforceable change in the law. And Claudette Colvin's testimony had been part of making it happen. She had sat in that courtroom. She had described what had been done to her. She had held up under questioning. She had been, in the quiet language of legal process, a credible and compelling witness. So in that sense, she had contributed twice. Once with her body, on the bus, and once with her voice, in the court. Twice toward justice. That phrase, the one that would eventually become the subtitle of the book about her life, captures something true. She hadn't done one brave thing. She had done 2. And neither of them had been easy. After the boycott ended and the legal victory was secured, life in Montgomery shifted. Not completely. Not immediately. The deeper structures of segregation were still very much in place. But one specific daily indignity had been removed. Black passengers could sit where they chose on the city buses. For the people who had walked for more than a year to make that happen, it meant something. For Claudette, watching from where she stood, it also meant something. Even if her role in it wasn't being announced to the world. She was 17 years old. She had already contributed more to the cause of justice than most people contribute in a lifetime, and yet, her name was not in the news. The stories being written about the boycott, the profiles being drawn of its leaders, the emerging narrative of what had happened in Montgomery. None of it centered on her. That was the way it was. She accepted it, in the way that people accept things they cannot change. Not easily, perhaps, but practically. She had her own life to attend to. She had a young son. She had the ordinary pressures of being a young person, without many resources in a complicated world. And gradually, the idea of staying in Montgomery became harder to hold on to. The South in the late 1950s was not becoming a more comfortable place for people who had made themselves visible in the way Claudette had. The civil rights movement was growing, but so was the resistance to it. Violence against black activists and black communities was real. The climate of fear was real. New York offered something different. Distance, anonymity, the possibility of starting fresh. She packed up her life and went north. It was the kind of quiet, private migration that doesn't show up in the history books. One person, carrying their belongings and their memories, leaving behind the place where something important had happened to them, and moving towards something uncertain but possibly better. Many thousands of black Americans made similar journeys during those years. It was part of a larger pattern, the Great Migration, stretching across decades, the movement of black families from the South to the cities of the North, looking for work, looking for safety, looking for a life that might be a little more their own. Claudette was one of those people. She arrived in New York City, and she began again. New York in the late 1950s was vast and loud and full of movement. It was not an easy place. It had its own forms of hardship, its own racial tensions, its own complicated geography of neighborhood and opportunity and limitation. But it was different from Montgomery. No one on the street knew who she was. No one knew what she had done. She was simply a young black woman from Alabama, trying to find her footing in a very large city. She found work. She built routines. She raised her son. The work she eventually settled into, as a nurse's aide, was work that suited her in ways that are easy to understand. It required steadiness. It required the ability to be calm in difficult moments. It required genuine care for other people. Those were things Claudette had in abundance. She was good at it, and she did it for a long time. Years, decades. The kind of working life that most people live without any particular recognition. Going in, doing the job, coming home, doing it again. There is nothing small about that kind of life. It takes real commitment, real patience, real humanity. And she brought all of those things to it. The decades moved forward. The 1960s came and went. The great legislative victories of the civil rights movement arrived. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the country changed in ways that Claudette had, in her own small and real way, helped to make possible. She watched all of it from her life in New York. She was not forgotten by everyone. There were people in Montgomery who remembered. There were researchers and historians who had found her name in the records. Her story was not completely buried, but it was not widely known. Not yet. The years have a way of accumulating quietly. One season follows another. A child grows up. A neighborhood becomes familiar. The sharp edges of old memories soften, not because they stop being true, but because life keeps adding new things on top of them. That was how it was for Claudette in New York. She had built something real there. A life with its own rhythms and its own small satisfactions. She knew her neighbors. She knew the streets around her home. She had her work, and she had her son, and she had the ordinary texture of daily life that most people spend most of their time inside of. It was not a glamorous life, but it was hers. And there is something worth honoring in that, in the simple fact of a person building a stable life, day by day, without fanfare or recognition, without anyone standing up to acknowledge what they had given or what they had carried. She had carried a great deal, not just the memory of what she had done on that bus, or what she had endured in the years that followed, but the particular weight of knowing that something important had happened, something she had been part of, and that the world had mostly moved on without including her name in the story. That kind of thing can do different things to different people. Some people grow bitter. Some people shrink. Some people spend their energy trying to reclaim something that feels like it was taken from them. Claudette did none of those things, or at least not in any way that consumed her. She kept going. She kept working. She kept showing up to the life in front of her. And somewhere inside her, she held on to the knowledge of what she had done. She knew. Even when no one else seemed to, she knew. And that quiet self-knowledge turned out to be a kind of anchor, something steady to return to. Through all the years and all the changes and all the long, ordinary stretches of a working life in a large city. She would talk about this later, in interviews, when the world finally began to ask her about it. She said that she had always known what she did was right, that she had never needed the world to confirm it, that the confirmation was real and present inside her, even when it was nowhere else. That is not a small thing. In fact, it might be one of the most important things about her, because the courage she showed on that bus in 1955 was not just a moment. It was a quality, a way of being, something that ran all the way through her, and that didn't disappear when the cameras went elsewhere and the world stopped paying attention. It stayed, and it sustained her through all the quiet years. Now, let's move forward a little more, because the story doesn't stay quiet forever. As the decades passed, the history of the civil rights movement began to be written and rewritten with increasing care and detail. Scholars were going back through the records. They were interviewing people who had been there. They were looking for the fuller picture, the one that included not just the famous names and the iconic moments, but the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things and then gone on living without much acknowledgement. Claudette Colvin appeared in those records. Her name was in the court documents from the Browder versus Gayle case. Her arrest was documented in the police records from Montgomery. Her testimony was there, in the transcripts. All of it was real and findable for anyone who looked carefully enough. And people began to look. A researcher named Joanne Robinson, who had been deeply involved in the Montgomery bus boycott herself, wrote about the events of 1955 and 1956 in a memoir published in 1987. Claudette's name appeared there, in context, as part of the fuller story of what had happened. Other historians picked up the thread. Slowly, carefully, in the way that careful historical work tends to happen, the picture began to fill in. But historical scholarship, as important as it is, tends to reach a fairly limited audience. Academic books and research papers find their way to libraries and classrooms. they don't always reach the wider world. What changed things more broadly was a combination of journalism and a particular book written for younger readers. In 2005, the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott brought a new wave of attention to the events of that year. Journalists and writers were looking at the story again. Some of them were asking the kinds of questions that hadn't been asked loudly enough before. Questions like, who else was there? Who else contributed? What is the complete story? And Claudette Colvin's name kept coming up. She was still alive. She was in New York. And she was, it turned out, willing to talk. She gave interviews. She spoke about her experiences with a clarity and a calm that struck people who listened to her. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to claim something dramatic. She was simply telling the truth about what had happened, in her own words, in her own voice. People found it compelling, because it was real, because she was real, because there was nothing practiced or polished about the way she told her story. It came from somewhere genuine. And then, in 2009, the book arrived. Philip Hoos had spent years researching Claudette's life. He had spoken with her at length. He had gone through the historical records. He had built a careful, detailed account of who she was and what she had done, and he wrote it in a way that was accessible to young readers. Clear, direct, respectful. The book was called Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. When it won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, it reached a new level of visibility. It was reviewed. It was discussed. It was put into school curricula. Young people across the country began reading it and encountering Claudette's name for the first time. For many of them, the discovery was striking. Here was a person who had done something genuinely important, who had come before Rosa Parks, who had contributed to a landmark legal case, and who had spent decades living quietly in New York while the world celebrated other people for things that were, in certain ways, continuous with what she had done. It raised questions, natural ones, about how history decides who to remember, about the role of strategy and circumstance in shaping the stories that get told, about what gets left out, and why, and what it costs the people who get left out. Claudette was asked those questions in various forms, over and over in the years that followed the book's publication. She answered them thoughtfully. She talked about the decisions that had been made in 1955, about why the leaders of the movement had chosen not to build the public campaign around her case. She said she understood the reasoning, even if it had been painful. She said she didn't think it had been done with cruelty. She said she believed the people involved were doing what they thought was necessary to achieve real change. And then she would say, quietly, that it had still hurt. Both things were true. Understanding a decision doesn't erase the pain of being on the receiving end of it. She had been 15 years old. She had done something brave and real, and she had been set aside. That had left a mark. She was honest enough to say so. But she was also honest about the fact that she had kept living, that she had built a life, that she had raised her son and done her work and found her own kind of peace with what had happened. She was not a broken person. She was a whole one, and that wholeness came through every time she spoke. The attention that came after the book continued to grow, slowly and steadily, through the years that followed. More interviews, more invitations to speak, more inclusion in documentaries and educational materials, and anniversary commemorations. The 50th anniversary of the Browder versus Gayle ruling and the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott brought Claudette into new conversations with a new generation of people who were learning this history for the first time. She was invited to Montgomery, going back to the city where she had grown up, where everything had happened. It was not a simple thing. Decades had passed. The city had changed. The laws had changed. And yet the memories were still there, vivid and particular, in the way that the memories of formative experiences always are. She returned with a kind of quiet dignity. She spoke about what she remembered. She stood in places that held history. And she received, from the people of Montgomery, and from civil rights organizations, and from the wider public, a recognition that she had waited a very long time for. It did not undo the years of silence. Nothing could do that. But it meant something. It was real. And she received it with the same calm grace she brought to everything else. One of the things that struck people who spent time with her during these years was how present she was, how grounded. She wasn't a figure from the past who had been preserved in amber. She was a living person with opinions and observations, and a way of looking at the world that had been shaped by everything she had experienced. She talked about race in America in the 21st century with the same directness she had always had. She saw the connections between the struggles of her youth and the struggles that were still ongoing. She understood that the work she had been part of was not finished, that the laws had changed, but the deeper work was still very much in progress. She had lived long enough to see that clearly. And she said so. Her voice in these later years carried a particular kind of authority. Not the authority of fame or celebrity, but the authority of experience, of someone who had actually been there, who had sat on that bus and refused to move, who had testified in federal court, who had watched the movement grow and the laws change, and the world shift in some ways, and hold stubbornly still in others. That kind of authority is rare, and people recognized it. Young people especially seemed to respond to her. She spoke at schools. She spoke at events organized by students who were learning about the civil rights movement and trying to understand what it had actually felt like to be inside it. She was patient with their questions. She didn't simplify things, but she also didn't make things more complicated than they needed to be. She told the truth, simply, directly. That was what she had always done. It was what she had done on the bus in 1955. It was what she had done in the courtroom. And it was what she continued to do, decades later, when the world finally came around to listening. There is something deeply reassuring about that kind of consistency, about a person who is, at their core, the same person across all the different chapters of their life, who doesn't shift depending on who is watching or what the moment requires, who simply remains themselves through all of it. Claudette was like that, 15 years old on that bus, 16 years old in that courtroom, a young mother building a life in New York, a middle-aged woman doing her work quietly and steadily, an older woman receiving long overdue recognition with grace and honesty, the same person, all the way through. That is not as common as we might like to think. It takes something, a kind of rootedness. a sense of self that doesn't depend too heavily on what the world reflects back, a willingness to know your own value even when no one else seems to. She had that. She had always had it. And it was, in many ways, the thing that made everything else possible. The refusal on the bus had required it. The testimony in court had required it. The long, quiet decades in New York had required it. And the later years of recognition required it too, in a different way. Because receiving attention after a long silence has its own challenges. There is a temptation to perform, to reshape the story, to fit what people want to hear, to become a symbol rather than a person. Claudette resisted all of that. She remained particular, specific, human. She talked about being afraid on that bus. She talked about the fear that had been right there alongside the certainty. She didn't present herself as someone who had been fearless. She presented herself as someone who had been afraid and had acted anyway. That distinction matters. Fearlessness is rare and not very relatable, but courage in the presence of fear is something most people can understand, something most people have experienced in smaller ways in their own lives. That was the kind of courage she described, and it made her story feel close, personal, real, not a monument to something distant and historical, but a reminder of something present and possible, that a person can know what is right, that a person can act on that knowledge even when it is frightening, that a person can be set aside and overlooked and still carry their sense of self intact through all the years that follow, and that the world, eventually, has a way of finding its way back to the truth, even when it takes a very long time. The night is still. The room is quiet. Let the story settle for a moment. We're not finished yet. There are still the final chapters of her life to explore. The ways the recognition continued to grow. The ways she continued to speak and to be present. The way her name became, gradually and surely, part of the story that gets told when people talk about what happened in Montgomery in 1955. But for now, just rest with this part of it. A life lived with dignity, with honesty, with a quiet and unshakable sense of self. Across all the decades, through all the silence, and into the light. At last, let's slow down for a moment and think about what Montgomery actually looked like in those years. Not the Montgomery of history books and documentary films, but the everyday Montgomery. The one that Claudette woke up in each morning as a girl. The one she walked through on her way to school. The one she knew in the particular, sensory way that children know the places they grow up in. It was a city of particular light. Alabama light has a quality to it, especially in the warmer months, which in Alabama is most of the year. It comes down strong and direct, and it sits on everything with a kind of weight. The streets in the middle of the day could feel very still, very bright. The shade under a tree or a porch roof was something people moved toward deliberately, gratefully. In the mornings, the air was cooler. There was often a softness to it before the heat fully arrived. Birds were audible. The sounds of a neighborhood waking up, doors opening, voices across yards, the particular sounds of a community that lived in close proximity and knew itself well. King Hill, where Claudette grew up, had that quality. It was the kind of neighborhood where the boundaries between houses felt porous, where children moved through the surrounding streets with a freedom that came from being known. where the adults around you felt collectively responsible for the children around them. That kind of community has its own kind of warmth. It also has its own kind of expectation. When everyone knows everyone, there is a sense in which your behavior reflects on more than just yourself. You carry your family with you. You carry your neighborhood. The things you do and the way you carry yourself have a weight that extends outward. For Claudette, growing up in that environment meant growing up with a strong sense of how to conduct herself, of what it meant to represent something, of what is owed to the people around her and to the community she was part of. That sense of responsibility ran deep. It showed up later in the way she spoke about her decision on the bus. She didn't describe it purely as an individual act. She described it as something she felt she owed to others, to the people who had come before her, to the community that had shaped her. The church played a large role in all of that. Sunday mornings in Claudette's childhood had a particular structure. Getting ready, walking to church, the gathering of familiar faces, the music, the sermon, the sense of being held inside something larger than any individual life. Black churches in the American South during that era were doing something that went beyond religious practice. They were maintaining a community. They were providing a space where dignity was affirmed and humanity was recognized in ways that the wider world often refused to recognize. They were also, in many cases, spaces where ideas circulated, where people talked about what was happening in the world, where the connections between faith and justice were drawn and redrawn. Claudette absorbed all of that. She grew up understanding that faith and action were connected, that believing something meant doing something, that the values she heard affirmed on Sunday mornings had implications for the way she moved through the rest of the week. Her teachers reinforced that too. At Booker T. Washington High School, there was a tradition of serious intellectual engagement. The school operated under constraints that no school should have to operate under. It was underfunded compared to the white schools in the city. Its students were navigating a world that placed obstacles in front of them at every turn. But within those walls, there were teachers who refused to let those obstacles define the ceiling. They pushed their students to read widely, to think carefully, to understand that their minds were capable of engaging with the hardest questions, to believe that the life of the mind was available to them, regardless of what the world outside said about their place in it. Claudette was the kind of student who responded to that. She was naturally curious. She liked ideas. She liked turning things over and looking at them from different angles. She was not the kind of person who accepted a thing simply because she had been told to. That quality was part of what made her a good student. It was also part of what made her dangerous to a system that depended on compliance. The segregated South required a particular kind of passivity from Black Americans. Not just legal compliance with unjust laws, but something deeper, a kind of internal acceptance, a willingness to receive the message, daily and from all directions, that you were less, that your comfort didn't matter, that your body could be directed and managed and moved around on a bus at the discretion of a white driver. The system worked best when people didn't just follow the rules, but believed, somewhere inside themselves, that the rules were right, or at least that they were inevitable. Claudette didn't believe that. She had grown up surrounded by people who didn't believe it either. Her family, her teachers, her church community, all of them had found ways to maintain their dignity and their sense of self inside a system designed to strip those things away. But Claudette was at an age where the gap between what she knew to be true and what the world was telling her had become impossible to sit with quietly. 15 is an interesting age for that, old enough to understand the full weight of the injustice, young enough to not yet have built up the layers of protective caution that adults accumulate over years of navigating a dangerous world, young enough to still believe, with some immediacy and urgency, that what is wrong should be confronted. There is a reason that young people have so often been at the forefront of movements for change, not because they are naive, but because the gap between what is right and what is hasn't yet been normalized for them in the way it sometimes gets normalized for people who have lived longer inside it. Claudette felt that gap with full force. And on the 2nd of March in 1955, she did something about it. We've talked about what happened on the bus, but it's worth lingering on the aftermath a little more, because the days and weeks after her arrest were their own kind of experience. She had to go back to school. She had to walk through the halls of Booker T. Washington High School as someone who had been arrested, as someone whose name had been in some of the local news, as someone who had done a thing that many people found remarkable and that some people found uncomfortable, and that a few people, even within the Black community, found troubling, because there were people who worried that this kind of direct confrontation would bring retaliation, who worried that it would make things harder rather than easier, who believed from long experience that the safest path forward was a more cautious one. Those worries were not unreasonable. They came from real knowledge of what the system was capable of, from real experience of what happened to Black people in the South when they were seen as too disruptive. Claudette navigated all of that. She was still a teenager, still in school, still trying to manage the ordinary pressures of adolescent life alongside something that was anything but ordinary. Her family stood by her. QP and Marianne Colvin had raised her. They knew who she was. And while her arrest had frightened them, as it would frighten any parent, they didn't withdraw their support. They were there. They held the household steady around her. That mattered more than it might seem. Having a stable home to return to. Having people who affirmed her, who didn't make her feel that she had done something wrong or embarrassing. That kind of grounding is essential, especially for a young person carrying something heavy. She was also supported by some of her teachers, people who quietly let her know that they understood what she had done and why, who continued to treat her with the same respect and engagement they had always shown her. Not everyone did. The world around her had its complications, but enough people did. Enough to hold her up through those immediate weeks and months. And then the larger machinery of the movement began to turn around her, in ways she could feel, but not fully see. Fred Gray, the young attorney who would go on to file the Browder versus Gayle case, was already thinking about the legal strategy. He was connected to the NAACP and to the wider network of civil rights lawyers who were mapping out how to challenge segregation through the courts. He saw Claudette's case clearly. He understood what it represented. and what it could potentially become. And when the decision was made not to build the public campaign around her, he didn't lose sight of her entirely. He kept her in view. And when the time came to file the federal lawsuit, he asked her to be part of it. She said yes without hesitation. That willingness to keep showing up, to keep being part of something even when you had been passed over, to not let hurt become withdrawal. That was another expression of who she was. She could have said no. She would have had every reason to. She had done something brave and been told, essentially, that her particular bravery wasn't convenient. Being asked to now participate in the legal process without the accompanying recognition was not a small thing to ask. But she said yes, because she believed in what was being fought for, not because of what it would mean for her, not because of the recognition it might bring, but because it was the right thing to do, and because she understood that the goal was bigger than any one person's story. That kind of generosity of spirit is not something that can be performed. It either runs through a person or it doesn't. It ran through Claudette, and it showed up again in the courtroom. When she testified in the Browder versus Gayle case, she was calm. She was clear. She answered the questions put to her with directness and with a steady composure that made an impression on the people in that room. She described what had happened on the bus. She described the rules she had been expected to follow. She described refusing to follow them. And she described why. She said that she knew her constitutional rights, that she had paid her fare like anyone else, that she had done nothing wrong. The court listened. And eventually, the court agreed. The ruling in Browder versus Gayle was a significant moment in the legal history of the civil rights movement. It established through federal court that bus segregation was unconstitutional. It was the ruling that actually ended bus segregation in Montgomery. Not the boycott alone, powerful as the boycott was, but the legal ruling that the boycott had helped to make possible, and that the testimony of Claudette Colvin and the other plaintiffs had helped to produce. That is a legacy, a real and concrete one, not symbolic, not gestural, but actual. A change in the law, a change in the daily experience of black residents of Montgomery who rode those buses. A change that had Claudette Colvin's name attached to it in the court records for anyone who looked. She was 17 years old when that ruling came down. 17 years old, and already part of history in two distinct and meaningful ways. And then she packed up her life and she went to New York, and the world moved on. But the records remained. The court documents remained. The testimony remained. The truth of what had happened remained, waiting quietly in the archives for the people who would eventually come looking for it. That is one of the things about historical truth. It doesn't disappear just because it isn't being talked about. It sits there, patient, unchanged, waiting for the moment when someone asks the right question and goes looking in the right place. And when that moment comes, it is still there, exactly as it was, exactly true. The room is quiet now. Outside, the night has fully settled. There is something calming about thinking of history that way, about the idea that truth has its own kind of patience, that it doesn't require our attention to remain true, that it simply waits and finds its way forward in time. Claudette's story was always true, even in the years when no one was telling it, even in the years when she was just a woman going to work in New York. just a mother, just a quiet person living a quiet life. The truth of what she had done was there, unchanged, waiting. And we are sitting with it now, quietly, in the dark, letting it settle. New York City in the late 1950s was a place of enormous energy. Even at night, even in the quieter neighborhoods, there was a hum to it, the sound of a city that never fully stopped, traffic in the distance, voices from open windows, the occasional rumble of the subway somewhere below the street. For someone arriving from Montgomery, Alabama, it must have felt like stepping into a completely different world, not just in terms of scale, though the scale was striking. New York was vastly larger than anything Claudette had known growing up. The buildings, the crowds, the sheer number of people moving in every direction at once. All of that was different, but it was also different in subtler ways. The particular texture of daily life in the segregated South had a quality that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived inside it. It was in everything, in which doors you used and which fountains you drank from, and where you sat, and how you were spoken to, and the thousand small daily reminders that the world had arranged itself to tell you something about your worth. New York was not a perfect place. It was not free of racism or inequality or hardship, not by any measure, but it was different. The specific architecture of Southern segregation, the legal codes and the enforced separations, and the particular humiliations that came with them, that was not present in the same way. For Claudette, arriving in the city with her young son and whatever she had been able to bring with her, there was likely a complicated mixture of feelings. Relief, perhaps, at the distance, at the absence of certain things, and also the particular loneliness of being a young person in a new place, far from the neighborhood that had raised her, far from the church that had held her, far from the teachers who had known her, far from the people who had watched her grow up. Starting over in a new city is always a kind of loss, even when it is also a kind of freedom. Both things can be true at once. She found her footing gradually. That is how it tends to happen, not all at once, not with a single decisive moment of arrival, but slowly, one familiar face, then another, one reliable routine, then another, the city becoming, over time, something that felt navigable, something that began to feel, in its own way, like home. She settled in the Bronx. The Bronx in those years was a borough with a strong working-class character. It had neighborhoods with deep community roots. It had churches and gathering places, and the ordinary infrastructure of people living alongside one another and building something shared. Claudette found her place in that world. She found work. She found, over time, a community. And she found the steady, daily rhythm of a life that was hers to shape. Her son grew. Watching a child grow up is one of the fundamental experiences of a life. It is slow and fast at the same time. The days can feel long, especially the hard ones. And then suddenly a child who needed you for everything is moving through the world with their own ideas and their own direction. Claudette experienced all of that. She was a mother in the fullest sense, present, attentive, determined to give her son a life that was stable and grounded, even without many of the resources that would have made that easier. She didn't talk publicly about those years in great detail. They were private years, personal ones, the ordinary, interior years of a life that was being lived from the inside, not performed for anyone else. But what is clear is that she managed. She more than managed. She built something real. On very little, in a very large city, as a young woman without a great deal of formal support. That takes strength. Not the dramatic, visible kind of strength that gets written about and celebrated, but the quiet, daily kind. The kind that shows up every morning and does what needs to be done and doesn't wait for acknowledgement. She had always had that kind of strength. It was the same strength that had kept her in her seat on the bus, the same strength that had carried her through the courtroom, the same strength that had allowed her to accept being passed over without being broken by it. It expressed itself differently in different circumstances, but it came from the same place, a deep, steady sense of self, a knowledge of who she was and what she was made of. That doesn't come from nowhere. It came from King Hill, from Mary Ann and Q.P. Colvin, from the church on Sunday mornings, from the teachers who had pushed her to think carefully and to believe in her own mind, from the community that had shaped her before she even knew it was shaping her. All of that had gone into making her who she was, and it traveled with her to New York. It stayed with her through the decades. The 1960s were years of enormous upheaval in America. The civil rights movement reached a kind of peak intensity during those years. There were marches and sit-ins and freedom rides. There was legislation. There was also terrible violence, bombings, assassinations, the death of people who had given everything to the cause of justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968. That year, 1968, was one of the most turbulent in modern American history. King's death, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the upheaval at the Democratic National Convention, cities burning, the country feeling, to many people who lived through it, like it was coming apart at the seams. Claudette was in New York through all of it. She was in her late 20s, a working mother, living a life that was connected to the larger currents of the time, but also separate from them, in the way that most individual lives are separate from the great events of history. She had her own grief, her own responses to what was happening. The death of King was not an abstract event for someone who had grown up in Montgomery, who had been 15 years old when the bus boycott began, who had known, in some personal way, the world that King had emerged from and the movement he had helped to lead. She had been part of that world. She had contributed to it, and now its most visible leader was gone. It is hard to know exactly what those years felt like for her from the inside. She spoke about them only in general terms, in the interviews she gave later in her life. She described the grief, the sense of loss, the fear that the progress that had been made might be undone. But she also described something else, a kind of persistence, a refusal to believe that the loss of one person, however significant, meant the end of the work. The work continued. It always had to continue. That was something she understood from the inside, from her own experience, because her own contribution had not been followed by an immediate and complete victory. She had done her part, and then more work had been required, and then more after that. That was the nature of it. Change didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, slowly, with setbacks, with losses, with a constant need to get up and continue, after things didn't go the way they should have. She knew that from personal experience, and she carried that knowledge through the turbulent years of the 1960s and into the quieter, more complicated decades that followed. The 1970s brought their own challenges to American cities: economic difficulties, neighborhood decline in many parts of New York, the particular hardships of urban life during a period when public investment in cities was contracting. The Bronx in those years was struggling. Many neighborhoods were dealing with poverty and disinvestment, and the visible deterioration that comes when a community doesn't receive the resources it needs. It was a difficult time and a difficult place. Claudette was there, working, caring for her family, managing the ordinary difficulties of a life being lived in challenging circumstances. She continued her work as a nurse's aide through these years. Healthcare work is interesting in this context because it is work that puts you in direct contact with human vulnerability, with people at their most frightened and most dependent. It requires a kind of steady presence, a calm that doesn't waver just because the situation is difficult. Claudette had that. She had demonstrated it under very different circumstances, years earlier. The ability to remain composed when the world around her was demanding that she be something other than what she was. That quality translated directly into the work she did in healthcare. She was good at being present with people who needed someone to be present. She was good at remaining calm. She was good at simply being there in a steady and reliable way, day after day. Those are not small things. In any profession, in any life, the years accumulated. Her son grew into a man. He built his own life. The household changed in the way that households change when children become adults and begin to move outward. Claudette entered middle age. The particular experience of middle age, when the urgent questions of youth have settled somewhat, and the shape of a life becomes clearer. When you can look back at what you've built and forward at what remains, that experience has its own texture. For Claudette, in those years, there was a long view available. She had done something remarkable at 15. She had testified in court at 16. She had raised a child largely on her own. She had built a stable working life in a difficult city. She had managed her grief and her disappointments without letting them collapse her. Looking back at all of that from the vantage point of middle age, it would have been possible to feel a complicated mixture of things. Pride, perhaps, in what she had survived and what she had built, and perhaps still some residual sadness about the recognition that hadn't come, about the years of silence, about the way her contribution had been absorbed into a larger story without her name being attached to it. Both things could coexist. They often do, in a life that has been long and complicated and real. She kept going. That is, in many ways, the central fact of her adult life. Not a dramatic keeping going, not a defiant or performative one, just the ordinary, daily commitment to continuing, to showing up, to being present in the life she had built. There is a kind of heroism in that, not the kind that gets commemorated, not the kind that appears in textbooks or documentary films, but a real kind, a human kind, the heroism of continuing, of not giving up, not because giving up isn't tempting sometimes, but because there are people and things and commitments that call you forward, and you answer that call day after day without ceremony. Claudette answered that call. Through all the decades, through all the quiet. And then the quiet began, slowly and gently, to change. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with a researcher finding her name in a court document, a journalist asking a question that led to another question, a writer deciding that her story deserved to be told fully and carefully, and with the respect it had always deserved. It started, as so many important things start, with someone paying attention, with someone deciding that the full truth was worth the effort of finding it. And once that process began, it had its own momentum. Because the truth was there. It had always been there. It just needed someone to bring it forward into the light. And once it was in the light, people responded to it. Because it was real. Because it was human. Because it was the story of a person who had done something genuinely important and then lived a genuine life and remained through all of it a genuine person. That kind of authenticity is rare, and people recognize it when they encounter it. They recognized it in Claudette, the interviews she began to give, the conversations she began to have with journalists and researchers, and young people who were learning her story for the first time. All of those encounters had a quality that people noticed. She was not performing a role. She was not presenting a curated version of herself. She was simply herself. Honest about the fear she had felt. Honest about the pain of being set aside. Honest about the long, quiet years. Honest about the complicated feelings that came with recognition arriving so late. And honest, too, about the things she was grateful for. The life she had built. The son she had raised. The work she had done. The community she had found. All of it was real. All of it was hers. And she claimed it with a quiet completeness that was, in its own way, one of the most moving things about her. The night deepens. The story continues to unfold. There is still more to come. The recognition continued to grow through the 2000s and 10s. Her name began to appear in school curricula across the country. Young people who had never heard of her began to learn what she had done, and she continued to be present for all of it, steady, grounded, real, as she had always been. We'll continue following her story into the later years, into the fullness of a life finally and rightly being seen. There is something particular about late recognition, about being seen, truly seen, after a very long time of not being seen. It is not the same as being seen early. It doesn't have the same texture. It doesn't arrive with the same lightness. Because by the time it comes, you have already built your sense of self without it. You have already learned to carry your own story. You have already found your own way of knowing your worth. And so when the recognition finally arrives, it lands on someone who has already done the work of being themselves without it. That changes the nature of receiving it. There is less urgency, less need, less of the raw hunger that might have been there in younger years. But there is also something deeply satisfying about it. A settling, a completion now, the feeling of something that had been left open for a very long time, finally, gently, closing. That is what the later years brought to Claudette Colvin. Not a transformation, not a sudden elevation into a different kind of life, but a settling, a sense of things coming into alignment after a long period of being slightly out of it. The book that Philip Hoos published in 2009 had opened something. It had put her name into classrooms, into libraries, into the hands of young readers who were encountering the civil rights movement for the first time, and learning that its history was fuller and more complicated than the simplified version they had sometimes been given. That mattered to Claudette. She had always cared about young people understanding the truth of what had happened. Not a cleaned-up version, not a version with the rough edges smoothed away, but the actual truth, with all its complications and its moments of genuine courage, and its moments of difficult calculation. She had lived that truth. She was well qualified to speak it, and she did. In the years following the book's publication, she became more publicly visible than she had ever been. She gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. She spoke at schools and universities. She appeared in documentary films about the civil rights movement. She participated in commemorative events. All of it was new territory for her. She had spent decades as a private person, decades during which no one was asking for her story, during which she was simply a woman living her life in New York without any particular public dimension to it. Now there was a public dimension, and she navigated it with the same steadiness she brought to everything else. She was not dazzled by attention. She was not made uncomfortable by it either. She simply engaged with it, honestly and directly, as she engaged with everything. People who interviewed her during those years often remarked on how present she was, how unguarded. She didn't have a prepared version of herself to offer. She didn't have talking points or a carefully managed narrative. She had her memory and her honesty and her willingness to sit with difficult questions and answer them as truthfully as she could. That made the conversations with her feel different from the kinds of conversations people often have with historical figures. There was no distance to it, no sense of accessing someone through a layer of carefully constructed legend. She was just there, saying what was true. One of the things she returned to in various conversations over the years was the question of why she had not been chosen as the central figure of the public campaign. It was the question people most wanted to ask her, and she answered it with a thoughtfulness that reflected how long she had lived with it. She understood, she said, that the leaders of the movement were making strategic decisions, that they were thinking about what would give the legal and public campaign the best chance of success, that they were operating in a world where the personal circumstances of the person at the center of a public fight could be used against the cause. She was a teenager, and later, in 1955, when she became pregnant while unmarried, that became one more factor in how some people judged whether she could be put at the center of a public campaign. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, those details carried weight, not just in white public opinion, which was clearly hostile to begin with, but even within the black community, which was navigating its own complicated internal conversations about respectability and strategy and what face to present to the wider world. She understood all of that. She said she had always understood it, at least intellectually. But she also said something else. She said that understanding something doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. She said that she had been 15 years old, that she had done something brave and real, and that being told, even gently, that her particular bravery wasn't what the moment required, had left a mark that took a long time to fully process. She was honest about that. She didn't wrap it in forgiveness too quickly. She didn't rush to say that everything had worked out fine and that she held no complicated feelings about it. She held complicated feelings about it, and she said so because that was the truth. The leaders of the movement, including people she respected and admired, had made a decision that affected her deeply. And while she believed they had made it for reasons they thought were good, she also believed that young people deserved the truth about how those decisions worked, about the human cost they carried, not to create bitterness, not to diminish the movement or the people who led it, but to give a fuller picture, to say, this is how change happens. It is not clean. It is not without cost. People get left out. People get passed over. And those people are real, and their experiences matter, and their stories deserve to be part of the record. That kind of honesty took courage. A different kind of courage from the courage she had shown on the bus, but courage nonetheless. The courage to tell a complicated truth, to resist the pressure toward a simpler, more comfortable version of events, to insist on the full picture, even when the full picture was uncomfortable. She had that courage. She had always had it. It showed up in different ways at different stages of her life, but it was the same fundamental quality, a commitment to what was true, even when what was true was hard. In the years after the book, she also began to receive more formal recognition from civil rights organizations and historical institutions. She was honored at events commemorating the Montgomery bus boycott. She was recognized by organizations that worked to preserve and teach the history of the civil rights movement. Her name began to appear more consistently in educational materials, alongside Rosa Parks and the other figures whose actions had shaped the Montgomery story. That inclusion meant something, not because she had been waiting for a certificate or an award, but because it represented a correction to the historical record, a filling in of something that had been left blank for too long. History is never finished. That is one of the things her story illustrates most clearly. The version of history that gets told first is rarely the complete one. It is shaped by the decisions of the moment, by what is convenient and what is strategic and what captures the public imagination, by who has a platform and who doesn't, by who gets to speak and who gets listened to. And then, over time, the fuller picture begins to emerge. Researchers find the documents. Writers ask the questions. People who were there begin to tell their stories more fully. And the history that we thought we knew turns out to be more complicated and more human than we realized. Claudette Colvin's story is part of that process. Her emergence from relative obscurity into wider recognition is not just a personal story. It is also a story about how history works, about the gap between what happens and what gets recorded, about who gets to be part of the narrative that a society tells about itself. She understood that. She spoke about it directly. She said that her story was not unique in that sense, that there were many people whose contributions to the civil rights movement had not been fully recognized, many people who had done brave and real things and had been left out of the larger story for reasons of strategy or circumstance, or simply the limitations of who was paying attention at the time. She was one of the visible ones now, but she knew there were others, and she used her visibility, when she had it, to point toward that larger truth, to say, Look more carefully. Ask more questions. The story you know is not the whole story. It never is. That was a generous thing to do with her platform. To use it not just to tell her own story, but to open up the question of whose stories are still waiting to be found. The years continued to move forward. The 2000s brought new conversations about race in America, new moments of public reckoning, new generations of young people engaging with questions of justice and history, and what it means to act with courage in a world that makes courage difficult. In that context, Claudette's story found new resonance. Young people learning about the civil rights movement were encountering her name with fresh eyes. They were asking, as young people tend to ask, the direct and sometimes uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't they heard of her before? Why had it taken so long for her story to be told? What did that say about the way history gets made and recorded? Those are good questions, important ones, and Claudette was there to help answer them. Not with anger or bitterness, but with honesty, and with the particular authority of someone who had lived the experience from the inside. She told young people the same things she told everyone, that she had been afraid and had acted anyway. That fear doesn't disqualify courage. It is the condition in which courage has to operate. That the right thing to do is sometimes clear, even when the world around you is telling you to do something else. And that a person's worth is not determined by whether the world recognizes it. That last point seemed to resonate especially deeply with young audiences, because young people often struggle with that, with the gap between what they know themselves to be and what the world reflects back, with the experience of being overlooked or underestimated or passed over. Claudette had lived that gap for decades, and she had emerged from it whole. That was something worth paying attention to, something worth learning from. She became, in those later years, not just a historical figure, but a living teacher, someone whose lessons were drawn not from theory, but from experience, from the actual texture of a life that had moved through difficulty and injustice and silence, and finally into a kind of clear and settled light. She taught by being who she was, by continuing to be honest, by continuing to show up, by continuing to say what was true, even when it was complicated, even when it was uncomfortable, even when a simpler version would have been easier. She had always done that, and she continued to do it, well into her 70s and beyond. The particular quality of a person who has lived a long life and retained their clarity and their honesty is something that is hard to describe, but easy to recognize. There is a settledness to it, a sense that the person has been tested by enough to know who they are, that they have moved through enough that nothing can really shake them loose from themselves anymore. Claudette had that. In every interview, in every conversation, in every public appearance, she was settled, not in a way that suggested she had stopped feeling things, not in a way that suggested she was no longer engaged with the world, but settled in the sense of being at home in herself, of knowing exactly who she was and where she had come from and what she had done. That kind of settledness is, in its own quiet way, one of the most powerful things a person can have. It cannot be taken away. It cannot be given by the world's recognition or removed by the world's neglect. It lives inside a person, and Claudette had it. She had had it since she was 15 years old on that bus. When the driver told her to move, and she looked inside herself and found something firm and clear that would not be shifted. That thing had stayed with her through the arrest and the courtroom and the move to New York and the decades of work and the long silence and the late recognition. It had never left, and it was still there, present and quiet and real, in the same way that the court documents were still there, unchanged. True, the room is very still now. The night is deep. Outside, whatever sounds the world makes are far away, muffled by distance and by the particular hush that comes when a night has fully settled. Inside, there is just this, the slow movement of a story being told, a life being laid out, piece by piece, in the gentle and unhurried way it deserves. We are nearing the later chapters now. Not the end, but the long, quiet, later section of a life that had covered an enormous amount of ground. A girl in Montgomery. A woman in New York. A voice that the world was finally, fully, learning to hear. We'll stay with her a little longer. There is still more to tell. And the night is patient. There is a particular kind of peace that comes with age. Not the peace of having resolved everything. Not the peace of a life without remaining questions or complications. But a different kind. The peace that comes from having lived long enough to see things whole, to hold the full arc of your own experience and understand it in a way that simply isn't possible when you are inside the middle of it. Claudette Colvin, in her 70s, had that kind of peace. She had lived long enough to see the movement she had been part of assessed and reassessed, long enough to see her own name move from obscurity back into the record, long enough to watch the country she had grown up in change in some ways and remain stubbornly unchanged in others. She had a long view, and she used it. When she spoke in those later years, there was a depth to what she said that came directly from that long view. She wasn't speaking from theory or from books. She was speaking from 7 decades of lived experience, from having been, as a child, inside one of the defining struggles of American history, from having watched its outcomes and its limitations play out across the rest of her life. That kind of perspective cannot be manufactured. It can only be lived into. And she had lived into it fully. One of the things she talked about in those later years was the relationship between the past and the present. She was clear-eyed about the fact that the changes she had helped to bring about, the legal dismantling of formal segregation, had not produced a country free of racial inequality. She said that directly. She said that laws could change and that daily realities could remain difficult in ways that laws alone couldn't fix. She had seen that in her own lifetime. She had seen the Civil Rights Act passed. She had seen the Voting Rights Act passed. She had seen legal segregation dismantled piece by piece. And she had also seen the persistence of poverty and inequality and discrimination in forms that were less visible, but no less real. She talked about that without despair, not because she thought everything was fine, but because she had learned over a very long life that despair was not a useful response to injustice. What was useful was continuing to work, continuing to speak, continuing to be present, continuing to insist on the full truth, even when partial truths were more comfortable. She had been doing that since she was 15 years old, and she had not stopped. The world she was speaking into in her later years was different from the world she had grown up in. In some ways, dramatically so. There was a black president of the United States. Barack Obama had been elected in 2008 and served 2 terms. That was something that would have been almost impossible to imagine from the vantage point of Montgomery in 1955. She had been asked about that, about what it meant to her, about how it felt to have lived long enough to see something so fundamental change. She answered thoughtfully. She said it meant something real, that it was not nothing, that the generation of people who had fought and marched and testified and been arrested and sometimes been killed for the cause of equality deserved to see that their work had produced something tangible. But she also said that one person in one office, however significant, was not the end of the work, that the deeper inequalities, the ones built into the structures of education and housing and employment and the criminal justice system, those required sustained effort across many generations. She had given her part of that effort, and she was clear that the next generations would need to give theirs. That was not a discouraging message. It was a realistic one, and it came with something important attached to it. The message that it was worth it, that the effort, even when it was slow and incomplete and sometimes painful, was worth making. She knew that from the inside. She had made an effort at 15 that had seemed, in the immediate aftermath, to produce very little for her personally. She had been arrested. She had been passed over. She had spent decades without recognition. And yet the effort had been part of something real, part of a chain of events that had changed the law, part of a chain of events that had made things genuinely better for real people in real daily life. That was worth something. That was worth everything. She said that to young people who asked whether the work was worth doing when the results were so slow and so incomplete. She said, yes, unequivocally and from experience. Yes. There were particular moments in her later years that stood out. One of them involved her legal record. For decades, Claudette Colvin had carried a criminal record from her arrest in 1955. The charges that had been filed against her had not been fully resolved in a way that removed them from the record. She had been a convicted person, technically, for all those years. In 2021, she sought to have that record expunged. She was 81 years old. Her attorney filed the petition in Alabama, and the court granted it. Her record was cleared. It was a quiet legal proceeding. It did not make enormous news. But for Claudette, it carried real weight. She said that it felt like the last piece of something finally being set right. That after all the decades, after all the recognition that had come in the years since the book and the interviews and the commemorations, there was still this one remaining thing, this formal legal mark that said, in the language of the law, that she had done something wrong. And now that mark was gone. The law that had put it there had been ruled unconstitutional decades earlier. The act it had been used to punish, refusing to give up a seat on a bus, had been recognized as an act of courage. And now the record itself had been corrected. It was as complete a legal vindication as was possible. And it came when she was 81. There is something almost perfect about that timing. Not perfect in a comfortable way, but perfect in a way that says something true about how long justice can take, about the patience required, about the fact that a person can wait a very long time for the world to catch up and still be there when it does. She was still there. She received the expungement with the same quiet grace she brought to everything. She said it meant a great deal to her. She said it felt right. She didn't perform a larger emotion than she actually felt. She simply said, "This is right, and I'm glad it happened." That was enough. That was exactly enough. The years between the publication of the book in 2009 and the expungement of her record in 2021 had been years of gradual and deepening recognition. Her name had become a fixture in civil rights education in a way it had never been before. Teachers across the country were including her story in their lessons. Museums and historical sites were incorporating her into their exhibits. Documentary filmmakers continued to seek her out. She remained engaged with all of it. She didn't retreat back into privacy when the attention came. She stayed present. She continued to speak. She continued to tell the truth. And she continued to do it in the particular way that had always characterized her. Simply, directly, without ornament or performance. Just the truth, told clearly by the person who had lived it. There was one dimension of her later years that seemed to bring her particular satisfaction, and that was the response from young people. She had always cared about young people, understanding the full story, about them learning not just the iconic moments, but the more complicated human reality underneath. And the response she received from young audiences suggested that the fuller story resonated with them. Students who read the book or heard her speak would write letters to her. They would tell her what her story meant to them. They would describe the way it had made the civil rights movement feel real and present and human, rather than distant and monumentalized. She valued that. Not the praise for its own sake, but the sense that the truth was reaching people, that young people were encountering a version of history that included the complications and the costs and the real human beings who had made it. That was what she had always wanted, for the full picture to be seen. She also continued to speak about fear. She returned to it often in various conversations because she felt it was important. She said that one of the things she most wanted young people to understand was that she had been afraid on that bus. Not a little afraid, genuinely afraid. She was 15 years old. She was being defiant to a bus driver in a city where that kind of defiance had real consequences. She was aware of what could happen. She had grown up in a world where she understood very clearly that black people who challenged the rules of segregation could face serious harm. She was afraid, and she refused anyway. She said that was the part that mattered most, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear be the deciding factor. She said she had learned, in the moment, something that she had carried with her ever since, that you can be afraid and still know what is right, that those two things can exist in the same body at the same time, that the knowing doesn't eliminate the fear, and the fear doesn't eliminate the knowing, and that in the space between them, there is a choice. She had made that choice, and she had made it at 15, before she had any real sense of what it would mean for the rest of her life. That is worth sitting with, because most of the choices that matter most are made before we fully understand their weight, before we can see where they will lead, before we know what they will cost or what they will eventually produce. We just make them in the moment with what we know and what we feel and what we believe to be true. and then we live with them. Claudette had lived with hers for more than 60 years, and she had found, at the end of that long living, that it was a choice she was at peace with, completely, without reservation. She would have done it again. She said so, directly, when she was asked. She said that if she could go back to that day, to that bus, to that moment, she would do exactly the same thing. Not because it had made her life easy. It hadn't. Not because it had brought her recognition in the years that followed. It hadn't done that either. Not for a very long time. But because it was right. Because the thing being asked of her, to give up her seat, to make herself smaller, to accept a treatment that her deepest self knew was unjust, was something she could not do. Not because she was fearless, but because she knew. She always knew. And knowing, for Claudette Colvin, was always connected to doing. That thread ran all the way through her life. From the girl in Montgomery, who read about the Constitution and felt the distance between what it promised and what her daily life contained, to the teenager who held her seat on a bus, to the young woman who testified in federal court, to the mother who built a life in New York without recognition or fanfare, to the older woman who told her story honestly and without simplification to anyone who would listen. The same thread, the same essential quality, a commitment to knowing the truth and acting in accordance with it, even when it was hard, even when there was no reward, even when the world wasn't watching, especially then, because that is when it matters most, when no one is watching, when there is no audience, when the only thing that counts is what you know is right, and whether you can find the courage to honor that knowledge. She found it, on a bus, in a courtroom, in a new city, in a working life, in the long, quiet years, and in the later years when the world finally came to find her. She found it, every time, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just quietly, steadily, the way she did everything. The night is deep now. The room is very still. The story is moving toward its final pages, not with a rush or a dramatic flourish, just a gentle settling. The way a life settles finally into the full shape of what it was. We'll stay with her a little longer, into the last quiet stretch, where the story comes to rest. Every life, when you follow it all the way through, arrives somewhere. Not necessarily at a destination that was planned or anticipated, not necessarily at a place that matches what was imagined at the beginning, but somewhere real, somewhere that reflects the accumulated weight of all the choices and circumstances and years that came before it. Claudette Colvin arrived somewhere real, a life that had begun in Birmingham, Alabama, in the final years of the 1930s. That had taken root in Montgomery, that had been shaped by a community and a church and a set of teachers who believed in the minds of their students. That had been marked indelibly by a single afternoon on a city bus. That had moved north to New York and settled into decades of quiet, steady work. That had been found, late and gently, by the recognition it had always deserved. That is where she arrived. Not at a monument, not at a ceremony, not at a moment of public triumph, but at a place of settled knowing, of having lived a life that was, in its deepest parts, consistent with who she was. That is not a small thing to arrive at. In fact, for most people, it is the thing most worth arriving at. She had been honest. She had been brave. She had been steady. She had done the work in front of her. whatever that work happened to be in whatever chapter of her life she was inside. She had told the truth. She had continued. And she had arrived, finally, at a place where the world could see her clearly, where the record had been set straight, where the young people reading her story in classrooms across the country could understand what she had done and why it mattered, where her name was part of the history it had always been part of. Whether the world knew it or not, she had always been there, in the record, in the documents, in the truth of what had happened in Montgomery in 1955 and 1956. She had always been there. The world had simply taken a long time to look. It is worth thinking about what it means to be a person whose contribution is real but unrecognized for most of their life, because it raises a question that goes beyond Claudette's individual story. It raises the question of how many others there are. How many people in the history of every movement for change, in the history of every struggle for justice, did something real and brave and lasting and were never acknowledged for it, never named, never included in the story that got told? Claudette herself raised that question. She pointed beyond herself. She said, in various conversations, that she was one of the visible ones, one of the people who had been found, eventually, and brought into the light. But she was clear that there were others, many others, people whose names were in no book, whose stories had been carried by no award-winning author, whose contributions existed only in the memories of the people who had been there, and in the fading traces of documents that few people had thought to look for. Those people were real too. Their courage was real. Their contributions were real. The fact that history had not found them did not make any of it less true. She wanted people to understand that, to hold that awareness alongside her own story, to let her visibility serve as a reminder of the invisibility of others. That was a generous thing to carry, to use the platform of her own recognition to point toward the ones who remained unrecognized. It was very much in character. She had never been someone who held things tightly for herself. Not her courage, not her truth, not her story. She offered them openly to anyone who was willing to listen and to learn from them. And people did listen, more and more as the years went on. Her story became a standard part of how the Montgomery bus boycott was taught, not just as a footnote or a footnote to a footnote, but as a real and integral part of the history, the part that came before the part that most people knew, the part that showed how the movement built itself incrementally through the actions of real people making real choices in real moments of fear and clarity. She was woven back in, the way she should have been all along, and the weaving was done carefully by historians and educators and writers who understood that the fuller story was also the truer story, that adding complexity did not diminish the achievement. It deepened it. It showed that the movement was not the product of a few exceptional individuals acting in isolation. It was the product of a community, of many people at many levels making many different kinds of contributions, some visible and some invisible, some remembered and some forgotten, but all of them real, all of them necessary. Claudette Colvin was part of that community, part of that collective effort, and her particular contribution, the specific and concrete things she had done, had real and lasting consequences. That is what she wanted people to understand. Not just that she had existed, not just that her name deserved to be remembered, but that what she had done had mattered, had changed something, had been woven into the fabric of real historical outcomes. The Browder versus Gayle ruling was a real ruling. It had real legal force. It had actually ended bus segregation in Montgomery, and her testimony had been part of what made it possible. That was not symbolic. That was not a consolation prize. That was the thing itself. She had helped to change the law at 16 years old in a federal courthouse in Alabama because she had told the truth clearly and without flinching. Let that settle for a moment, because it is remarkable, not in a distant, abstract, historical way, but in a very immediate and human way. A teenager sitting in a courtroom telling the truth about what had happened to her on a bus, and the law changing as a result. That is how change happens. Not only through marches and speeches and iconic moments captured in photographs, but through the quieter, more intimate acts of individual human beings, standing up in whatever room they happen to be in and telling the truth, and refusing to sit down until it has been heard. Claudette did that twice, on the bus and in the courtroom, and both times it mattered. Both times the truth she told had weight, had consequence, had impact that moved out from her and affected the lives of real people in real ways. That is a legacy, a genuine one, and it was established before she was old enough to vote. The arc of her life from that point forward was long and complicated and full of all the ordinary and extraordinary things that a long life contains. The move to New York, the work, the raising of a son, the decades of quiet, the late recognition, the interviews and the books and the commemorations, the expungement of the record, the long view from the far end of a life that had covered an enormous amount of ground. All of it built on that foundation. Those 2 moments of quiet courage, a seat on a bus, a voice in a courtroom. That was where it all began. And everything that came after was, in some sense, an expression of the same essential person who had been present in those 2 moments. The same knowing, the same steadiness, the same commitment to what was true, just expressed in different ways, in different contexts, across different decades, in a life that kept moving forward, through everything. She never stopped moving forward, even when the world around her seemed to have stopped moving in her direction, even when the recognition was absent and the silence was long. She kept going. She showed up. She did the work. She told the truth. She continued. And that is perhaps the deepest thing her story has to offer. Not just the dramatic moment, not just the bus and the courtroom, but the decades in between. The ordinary, unseen, uncelebrated decades of a life being lived with integrity and consistency and quiet dignity. Those decades matter. They are not the backdrop to the important parts of the story. They are part of the important parts of the story because they show what happens after courage, what it looks like to carry something meaningful through the long, ordinary stretch of a life, what it means to continue being yourself, consistently and without performance, across all the different chapters that a long life contains. She showed what that looks like, and that is a lesson worth learning, worth carrying, worth returning to, especially in the moments when the work feels slow or invisible or unrewarded, especially in the moments when the gap between what should be and what is feels too wide to bear. Those are the moments to think about Claudette Colvin, about the decades she spent in New York, working quietly, carrying her story without recognition, about the way she kept her sense of self intact through all of it, about the way she kept knowing what she knew, even when no one else seemed to, and about the way the world eventually found its way back to the truth, the way it always does. If enough people are committed to finding it, she was committed to it all her life, and she helped others find it too. That is the shape of her contribution, seen whole, not just a moment, not just a refusal, not just a courtroom, but a life, a long, full, complicated, honest life, lived in consistent alignment with a set of values that she had arrived at early and never abandoned. That is rare, and it deserves to be seen. It deserves to be remembered. It deserves to be held gently in the mind on a quiet night like this one, as the breathing slows and the thoughts grow softer and the day's concerns begin to drift away. Let the image of her settle. A girl on a bus, knowing what she knew, holding her ground, not because she was fearless, but because she was clear. And let that clarity be something you carry too, into whatever tomorrow brings. The knowledge that knowing what is right is its own kind of strength, that continuing is its own kind of courage, that a life lived honestly, even quietly, even without recognition, leaves something real in the world, something that lasts, something that matters, even when no one is watching, even when the years are long and the silence is deep. It matters. It always matters. Claudette Colvin knew that. She knew it at 15. She knew it at 80. She knew it all the way through. And now, quietly, through the telling of her story, we know it a little better too. The night is very still now. The story has found its resting place. Thank you for spending this time with the life of Claudette Colvin, a girl from Montgomery, a woman who held her ground, a voice that the world took too long to hear, but that never stopped speaking. She is part of the record now, fully and rightly. And so the story rests here, quietly, complete. If sleep is finding you now, let it come. The night is good and soft, and tomorrow will be there when you wake. For now, just rest. Just breathe. Just let the quiet in. Good night.